Walking 10,000 steps a day has become probably one of the most popular workout strategies, especially for beginners in recent times. It has been set as the minimum that one is required to walk per day in order to them to be considered sufficiently physically active and for them to stay in good health. This is what most fitness coaches would recommend. However, where did all of this originate from? Why do we need to walk this exact number per day? And is there any scientific evidence backing that? Unless you work as a waitress or some kind of service worker where you're on your own to feed the entire day, it's probably pretty hard for you to be getting 10,000 steps per day every single day in the week. Interestingly, the entire idea about 10,000 steps originated from Japan in the previous century. The Japan symbol for 10,000 actually looks very similar to a walking or running person, however you interpret it. In 1964, as the Tokyo Olympics started approaching, Japanese people were generally very focused on improving their fitness and battling the rising rates of obesity. 10,000 steps per day became a general recommendation at that time for them to improve their health and reduce their risk of lifelong diseases such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. At this time, a type of pedometer was also introduced. It's not the same as the type of smartwatches as we have today, obviously, but it was a gadget that they were wearing on their waist that would then help them count their daily steps. The Japanese name for 10,000 is Manpo-kei. Feel free to correct me if that is being mispronounced. This recommendation became something that most people were aspiring to adhere to at that time. I don't know how this then got so popular that now the entire world feels obliged to walk 10,000 steps per day, but this is where the entire thing started. For Japanese people, that seems to be working. I suppose they're doing a lot of other things besides that, but if you did not know this, the obesity rate in Japan is one of the lowest in the world, with the amazing 4.5%. For a comparison, in the US, it's like around 43%, so that's almost 10 times more than in Japan. And this is not because they do not have any delicious food available. You know how good Japanese food can be, and also how fattening and full of sodium, fats and sugar it can be. Enough about Japanese foods, let's go into the scientific research. So there have been multiple studies inspired by this recommendation that investigated the impact of walking exactly 10,000 steps per day for sedentary individuals, so people that were not very physically active prior to the intervention. This one study investigated the impact of walking 10,000 steps per day on overweight adults. They were 38 in total, the ones that completed the intervention, and they had to walk this number of steps for 36 weeks. Of course, their progress was monitored with a pedometer, so they were not just reporting randomly how much they were walking. And this study found that in all of the participants, there were significant improvements in body weight, fat mass, also their waist circumference, and an increase in the good cholesterol, so high density lipoprotein. These are all amazing findings that were due to this addition to their daily physical activity. Another study investigated the impact of walking 10,000 steps per day in Thai subjects. And this one did not only cover the impact on their physical but also their mental well-being. The study found that there were significant improvements again in both their physical parameters, so body weight and fat mass, cholesterol levels, but also their mental parameters. So of course they're subjective, but participants were reporting to have lower fatigue, lower anxiety, lower depressive symptoms compared to before the intervention started. Another study subjected again to a similar intervention, 29 sedentary adults. They had 22 women and 7 men, and the study again found significant significant beneficial effects on their both mental and physical well-being. You see how all of the scientific data really supports that walking 10,000 steps per day does improve one's health, especially if the participants were sedentary and were not having any consistent workout regime prior to the intervention. However, now we're going to go into the studies that talk about walking in general and walking different numbers of steps per day, not specifically 10,000. We're starting off with this analysis of 15 international studies that investigated the impact of walking on people's health. And the subjects in the studies were separated into two groups depending on their age. One group was below 60 years old and the other group was above 60 years old. And here, as you can see in the graph that I'm about to put on the screen, there are significant improvements in their overall risk of mortality, even at much lower step counts. And also the decline of the risk is not linear, so the risk declines up to a point, but at some points additional steps per day do not seem to make any difference. For the adults that were below 60 years old, this plateau in the improvements comes later compared to the older adults, and with the younger group, their plateau comes at around 10,000 steps per day, but you see that there is a huge decline in the so-called hazard ratio that is calculated here, even at numbers such as 5,000 steps per day. For the older participants, this bigger decline in the risks comes even earlier, even at around 3,000 steps per day. It seems to peak at around 6,000 steps per day. The point that I'm trying to make here is that you do not have to aspire to that specific number each day. Even if you do not manage to get to that number, walking a significant amount each day does do a big difference in overall mortality risk, even if you do not get to this exact number. This number is actually where the risk seems to plateau, and any more steps than that do not seem to make really a difference. Another review went over studies that investigated the association between daily step count and mortality in US adults, and this study again confirms that even lower numbers of steps, such as 8,000 steps for 1 or 2 days in the week, also led to a huge improvement in the cardiovascular risk factors for US adults. Therefore, even a little bit of exercise a week goes a long way, especially compared to a complete lack of physical activity. This is a very pretty graph that I'm about to show you from the third review. It again investigates the mortality risk from all cause and also cardiovascular diseases. Here the researchers found a dose-response relationship between the amount of steps and a decrease in the mortality risk, and a 1,000 step increase per day led to a drop of 15% in the mortality risk, and each 500 step increase led to another 7% drop in the mortality risk. Therefore, again, what I'm trying to say is that any movement is better than no movement, and a 10,000 step per day is not a magical number that everyone has to reach to be in good health. One of the studies that was investigating the 10,000 steps per day actually mentioned something very important. That big amount of steps per day is something to aspire to each day if you are opting that out for the recommended 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity physical activity. If you aspire to replace that recommended amount of physical activity with walking, then you would have to walk 10,000 steps per day for all days, or at least for most days of the week. However, if you do perform some other type of workout, there is no need for such excessive movement each day, especially considering that there are so many other stress factors in our day-to-day life. A lot of people have families that they need to take care of, or their job is just so time-consuming that they cannot simply get to that number each day. And for those people, knowing that you can opt out for a few workouts per week instead of having to walk that much each day is something very important, I believe. However, for people that do have the ability to walk that much each day, this is a great opportunity, especially considering that it's accessible to everyone, especially in countries that have moderately good weather. If you live somewhere where it's cold and dark most of the time, then you might opt also for a walking pad and try to integrate this into your daily routine somehow. You could do this while you're studying for an exam, you could do this while you're having a meeting even, if people don't notice, and if you're working remotely. Of course, there are even some office buildings where they do have walking pads for people to use during meetings. I actually think this is a very cool idea, especially, I don't know if you have this, but the way that the toes flow while you're walking is much smoother for me personally compared to when I am sitting down. This is why probably a lot of people tend to go around the room while they're having a talk on the phone. It is just much more comfortable. I feel like you are also able to get a lot more creative while you're performing some type of physical activity. Walking is also a low intensity exercise, and it is a great option if you want to have an active rest day, let's say. Exercise, while it has amazing benefits for you, in very high amounts each day can actually have a counteractive effect. And this is because, as this review here says, if you're performing way too much exercise, strenuous exercise, that can actually trigger a pro-inflammatory response in your body. While a normal amount of exercise that is not stressing you out too much would then result in the opposite. It would have an anti-inflammatory effect on your body, on your organs, generally on your entire biochemistry. However, if you have goals, especially muscle building goals, walking is not gonna do it. Again, it's a great form of physical activity. It's a great form if you just want to get your body moving, but if you have some other type of aspirations, especially considering getting more toned or building some muscle, then you have to opt for a completely different type of training regime. This is also a personal reminder to myself: if you're doing way too much walking or sitting down, do not forget to put your legs on the wall while you're laying down on the bed or on the couch, whatever, just for the blood flow to go in the opposite direction every night. It can make a difference in your entire blood flow. I find that with way too much standing or way too much walking, sitting, really my blood flow does kind of not work as well as it should be working, and doing this simple trick every evening can lead to some improvements in one's well-being. I unfortunately forget to do it very often, and I need to start. That's why I'm putting it in the video. Anyways, I hope that you got the idea now of why 10,000 steps per day exists as a recommendation. Let me know down in the comments below if you have in mind a specific topic that you would like me to do next time. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content of the video. Thank you again very much for watching, and I will be seeing you in the next one.